In the past 24 hours, news has broken that Texas and Oklahoma are interested in joining the SEC, which would make the SEC the first 16-team super conference. I'm going to be reading an article by CBS Sports written by Barrett Salih, and I'm going to just be discussing my thoughts on this and what I think the ups and downs could be, and then talk about if this could be the end of the Big 12 conference and where I think the Big 12 would go if this were to happen. So, apparently, as if the college football playoff expansion and name, image, and likeness rights were not enough to shake up the sport, this is the article, by the way, another round of conference realignment appears to be only a matter of time. Texas and Oklahoma have reached out to the SEC about leaving the Big 12 and joining the nation's most powerful conference. Supposedly, the source was a high-ranking college official with knowledge of the situation. Pretty anonymous as it gets, and that the SEC could announce the additions of the Longhorns and Sooners within a couple of weeks. Yeah, things might move that quickly. I'm presuming this would mean that Texas and Oklahoma would have one more year left within the Big 12 before joining the SEC, of course. SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey, along with officials from Texas and Oklahoma, have all released statements refusing to comment on these posts. There have been no outward denials to this point, however. So, looking at this just plainly, to a certain extent, this doesn't surprise me because the SEC is a very powerful conference. Teams from the Big 12, Nebraska, Missouri, and Texas A&M have already left to join other conferences, Colorado as well. But I'm talking about schools leaving to join arguably more powerful conferences, the Big 12 and SEC, namely. And then they added teams like West Virginia and Texas Christian, which are arguably a little weaker. And then you kept around teams like Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State. Really, the only traditional powerhouses in the Big 12 at the moment are Oklahoma and Texas. And Oklahoma is the only, out of those two, is far better. And Texas is on one of its not so good trends in its football history. So this move for a team like Oklahoma, I think makes perfect sense. You're doing pretty well. You might not be winning national titles and all, but like Nebraska left the Big 12 under Pelini when they were constantly having 10 wins. Mizzou left for the SEC under Gary Pinkel when he was constantly contending for Big 12 titles, and A&M was also at one of its lower points, but when they moved, they immediately just kind of went on what seemed to be at the time a bounce back. But for Oklahoma, I think this move makes far more sense, and one of the reasons for that, I'm going to list a reason why it makes sense, or maybe a few, and then one or a few reasons why I think it doesn't make sense. Oklahoma and Texas moving to the SEC makes sense because if they move to the SEC, and if, let's say, the East and West of the SEC remain, they won't be facing Alabama every year, which contradicts what you might think, because they would be in the West part of the SEC. And I say that because Alabama and Auburn are the teams closest to the East Division, and if the alignment remains geographical, I would immediately presume that Alabama and Auburn, just looking at a map, would be switched over to the East, which would create a huge imbalance, and then Oklahoma and Texas would come in along with A&M, LSU, Mississippi State, and Arkansas. And maybe you'd also have to switch, most likely, Mizzou back over to the West. Just looking at that. So they wouldn't likely, I don't think, if they keep the East and West together, Oklahoma and Texas would not have to face Alabama, and they would still get the prestige of being in the SEC conference, probably definitely more lucrative TV deals, more money, just more respect from sports fan bases, which will lead to more money again. Big 12 is not popularly respected from, I'd say, any fan bases outside of the Big 12. But the SEC universally is. People hate the SEC because the SEC is touted as the best conference at the moment, and moving to a better conference would certainly boost income for Texas and Oklahoma, who already earn a lot of money. Now, the reason it wouldn't make sense here is because for a team like Texas especially, you're moving to a harder conference. And harder conference means you ain't going to be winning as much. This is kind of like Nebraska heading to the Big Ten. They get more lucrative TV deals, but they haven't been relevant at all in the Big Ten. They just haven't. And granted, they are in the Big Ten West, but that's another conversation for another day. So you move to the SEC, and you have a tougher schedule. Granted, you only do have those 8 mandatory conference games, which could be expanded to 9 if, say, teams want to keep their cross-division rivals while having 16 teams. It may be expanded to 9, who knows. But with a team like Texas, and even with a team like Oklahoma, going into a tougher conference, you do risk not winning as many games and not being able to hang as many banners on your trophy room. And this may not be a big deal to everyone, and it may, I don't really know how to put it here, but I just think if you're a Texas fan, you're already going 7-6, 8-5, 9-4. Do you really want to go in a tougher conference and see the possibility of going 6-7 and 7-6 and 8-5 more often, and really having a harder time getting that 9, 10, 11 win seasons that are rare to come by? Because I don't know what would be preferred there, because Texas is still on they haven't climbed out of the hole yet. And even with a team like Oklahoma, are you willing, as fans, are you going to, you're obviously going to be excited about moving to the SEC if it happens, but if you go, are you going to complain immediately when your team faces tougher competition and you might have to get to seeing more 2-loss regular seasons and even some 3-loss regular seasons? Or if you get to the championship game, are you going to be willing to see some pretty tough losses to teams that are far better than your Texas Christian, Texas, Oklahoma State, and Iowa States that you're facing regularly? And you, in the SEC too, you don't, every team besides maybe Vanderbilt now, in my opinion, can do something against any team. It's a very competitive division that you're moving into. So as fans, are you willing to take the sacrifice to possibly not seeing as many wins to move into a more lucrative conference, if that makes sense? I'm not a Big 12 or SEC guy, so bear that in mind while listening, but I did want to talk about this because with conference realignments and all of this, you have to keep everything in mind. Sure, you have more lucrative TV deals. You're no longer going to be made fun of for being in arguably a weaker conference than the Big Ten and SEC, or even some could argue ACC, though that's a different debate. But now that you move into said tougher conference, let's even theorize that Alabama and Auburn do move to the West, so you don't have to face them. You're still facing A&M, who's better than they were. You're facing LSU, who's still fresh off a national title. And Mississippi and Mississippi State look to improve, just assuming for the next few years. You go in there, and the neighborhood's immediately tougher. You have to play a whole different ball game when it comes to recruiting, and even just on the field. You have to have defense, in my opinion, in the SEC to beat some of the smaller medium-tier schools that could surprise you. And you have to have defense to not get destroyed by the Alabamas, Georgias, and Floridas, and LSUs, and even Texas A&Ms of the world. So, are you willing to possibly see less wins to simply move into that tougher conference? Is that worth it? That's kind of the trade-off I see here. But back to the Big 12 in general, from what I see, you lose Texas and Oklahoma, your biggest brands by far, the whole conference collapses. You now have 8 teams left over, and now is the just short period of time where I'm going to talk about where I think the teams will move to. If Oklahoma and Texas leave for the SEC, what next makes logical sense is likely for West Virginia to move to the ACC or Big Ten. Iowa State likely also to the Big Ten, in my opinion. And Kansas State, I honestly don't know. I mean, Kansas and Kansas State, Kansas has not played at the Power 5 level since Mark Mangino, but so they could always move to a Group of 5 place, though I don't think they would like that. Kansas State, I think, could contend maybe for the Big Ten, just geographically, but then you also have to remember the Pac-12's over there, and the Pac-12 could accept, say, Baylor, Texas Christian, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma State, too. And at the same time, just to get this out of the way as well, this will be the last thing I talk about. What happens to these rivalries? What happens to the Oklahoma State game or the Texas Tech game? What happens to those? I mean, those are rivalries that have happened forever. They're even interstate rivalries, and they're taken very seriously, and they're entertaining. What's going to happen to those? Because there's no way that Texas Tech and Oklahoma State are going to want to join the SEC, and if they do, that's a death sentence for any of their current head coaches. I mean, you think that Mike Gundy can win 9 or 10 games in the SEC? I mean, maybe he can, but looking at his current state, they have to try hard to win 8-9 games in the Big 12. Do you really think that Mike Gundy and Matt Wells can survive even in a weaker SEC West division? What's going to happen to those games? Tell me in the comments below what you think would happen to these games if Oklahoma and Texas were to move to the Big 12. That's all I have to say for today. I just really wanted to talk about this because I think it's interesting. I never saw this coming. I thought that if anyone was to move, I didn't think that anyone would really want to move to the SEC at this point, besides maybe some ACC teams. That would have been the closest I would have thought. I would have never thought that Texas and Oklahoma, as they are like well-known Big 12 members, I never thought they would have moved to the SEC if they end up doing. Personally, I don't know. I really don't have a prediction as to whether they will move to the SEC or not. But I think if they want to, I think the SEC would welcome them with open arms to increase their popularity and power. Again, if you like this video, remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment your thoughts below. That's all I have to say, and I'll see you around.